So the reason I've been thinking about brains in vats is because people keep talking about simulation hypothesis
Right.
now today in popular culture because of Bostrom and because of the Matrix. And there's this problem with the Matrix that some people have charged, and that is that Neo never questions his reality once he woke up from the Matrix. And as I've been thinking about this, it seems to me that he has acquired a defeater for all of his beliefs because he was systematically deceived and none of his concepts referred to the real world. And then he came to wake up and he doesn't have any concepts that have been in contact with the real world. And then furthermore, he's already been duped once. So why think that he is now in base reality? And I wanted to get your thoughts as I don't know. Are you an externalist concerning? It seems like you probably are externalist concerning justification. I
Yes.
wanted to get your
Yep.
take on Neo's predicament once he wakes up out of the Matrix.
So it's been years since I've seen The Matrix, so I'm just going on what you told me right now, rather than my memory of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But what you put your finger on strikes me as one of the really delightful, albeit dizzying and disorienting effects of thinking about these matters. And that is, at what point, if ever, can we say, okay, now I've got firm ground beneath me. Now I can begin to say, this is the real world. I'm engaging now with the real world. My previous perspective, albeit fundamentally deceived, is now a perspective that I've thrown off for the correct one. And it does strike me that once you get into the dizziness of the first and second meditations, I think Descartes describes it well, it's really difficult to see your way out of it. One of the things that prompted me to be as you call it, an externalist about justification, that is someone who thinks that, for example, my beliefs can be well off, even if they can be justified, they can be well grounded, they can be based on good evidence, even if I am not in a position where I can tell you the basis on which I formed them, even if the things that do the justifying are beyond my ability to conceive or think about. One of the things that convinced me of that was the desire to get past these problems so that we could begin to think about real life problems. Like, for example, interested, when is a person justified in believing in real life cases? So if a person says that's a tree and it turns out she was wrong, a lot of times, whether or not how we assess her performance, her behavior is going to depend on whether we thought she was justified in believing it was a tree. And those are the kinds of questions that really interest me. And that's why I thought, we've got to put skepticism aside. One way to do so is to be an externalist about justification.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. I hate to drag you back down into it with another question. But with the simulation hypothesis, it's a bit different than brain in a vat because, well, at least if we just stick to Bostrom's view, so it's different than the Matrix because you're not a brain in a vat. You are a digital conscious being, and so you'd have to have a functionalist theory of mind or something like that in order to get that kind of thing. So let's just say that's that. In my head, I developed this kind of argument, and it's probably no good, but it seems to me like the simulators have created these sims, like you and I are sims in this simulation, but our beliefs are directed not at truth, not at the truth of base reality, but they're designed to work and think within the simulation. And so I've called it something like it's Plantingian improper function because it's not directed at truth. So people like Chalmers have said in I think his paper Matrix as Metaphysics that you could be Neo could be justified in the Matrix. He thought he's in Manhattan, but really, maybe he's in New Jersey in base reality. But qua the Matrix, he's justified. That's fine with me. But as soon as Neo starts to think about him being a sim, that's where I think it breaks down for me, because that's where I think the content externalism comes into play. Like how could he think about base reality if he comes to believe that his mind has been developed to reason within the simulation? Does that make sense to you at all?
Absolutely. It makes sense. I want to just go back for a second and talk a little bit about proper function, because I wonder whether there's a slippage that is a little quick, and I'd love to just call attention to it. I think when you mentioned Plantingian proper function, you immediately assumed that the proper function of belief would be truth, and certainly there are people who will think that. Keep in mind that not everyone will think of proper function in the same way. So, for example, things that are designed can have proper functions. Their function comes not from evolution, but it comes from design. So,
Right.
if in what we're talking about, the simulation, the simulator is the one who actually created the program, designed these things so that the aim of belief would be to conform to the simulation. It could well be true that a belief that does so is fulfilling its proper function,
Right.
even though it's not true.
Definitely. Yeah.
So that's an important point. Then I would say, I mean, your comment your question is a nice one. I don't quite know what to make of the of Neo as he's coming out. Your sense, let me just see if I have this. Your sense, Parker, is that if semantic externalism is true, then Neo can't make sense of his situation. He can't even so much as formulate the thought that he's been radically deceived. Is that your worry?
No, I think that he can formulate it. So maybe Neo's not helpful because he is a little brain in a vat. But like, let's use me and say I'm a sim. I'm just
Okay.
There's nothing else, but I'm just a computer program.
Yep.
And now I come to believe that I'm a computer program, and that someone designed me to think in this reality. That's fine. I could still have, maybe if Chalmers is right, I have justified beliefs about the simulated world. But then when I come to the belief that my cognitive faculties have been designed to function in the simulated world, then I see maybe a self-defeat argument when I start reasoning about
see what you mean.
base reality.
I see what you mean. I'm going to repeat this back to you, Parker, because I want to make sure I've got this. This is a nice thought. Your thought is, you could well, as a sim, you could well come to the justified belief that you were a sim and that your mental faculties were designed for the sim experience.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do come to that conclusion and then get some sense that you've left the sim experience, the fact that you know, or the very fact that you came to the conclusion, the justified conclusion that your faculties were designed for the sim experience, may defeat any justification you have for believing anything about the non-sim experience. Is that a fair way to put it?
That's right. And so then I couldn't believe anything about the non-sim experience, including that I am a sim, because that's a thought from the outside. But then maybe even still, if it's in proper function, if it's if my cognitive faculties have been designed and that it's aimed not at truth, but at whatever we call the simulated world, then I come to believe that, but I'm acting as if I know that as truth. But it seems like I might have a defeater then for all of my beliefs, including the belief that I live in a computer simulation. So there might be like two lines of thought here.
Good. So I want to play the devil's advocate, not because I'm confident that there's anything on the other side, but just to see how far we can push your thought and whether it's going to stumble. I wonder whether we can say that just because you're using your belief, your cognitive faculties under conditions in which they were not, under conditions for which they weren't designed, I think you are regarding that as soon as you recognize that, you're regarding that as a defeater. I wonder whether that's too strong.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether even if I come to know that I'm using cognitive faculties under conditions for which they weren't designed, all that will do is it will make it so that I shouldn't rely without further ado on those faculties. But it doesn't mean that I can't rely on them at all. Here's the kind of thing that I have in mind. Imagine that I come to learn a game, and that game is a complicated game, and I get really, really good at it. And I have a bunch of principles that I use when I play the game. And then imagine that somebody introduces a new game to me, and they say to me, "Hey, Sandy, this is a lot like the previous game, but it's a little bit different." Does that mean that I can't use any of the principles I used before? Well, it does mean I shouldn't use them uncritically. That's for sure. But it's not obvious that it means that I shouldn't use any of them. Maybe I actually want to try to use them, albeit critically, and get information on them. But if I get a little bit of information that they're working well, maybe that's sufficient to tell me that I can still continue to use them. And similarly with cognitive faculties under conditions for which they weren't designed. That's a thought. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's a really good thought. I want to push back and say, well, it's not just random rules, or it's not just rules that we're appropriating for different, or rules or tools that we're appropriating for a different circumstance, but it's it might be a special case because it's actually our cognitive faculties. And so maybe the disanalogy between the two would be, in one, you have the same cognitive faculties that are appropriating different rules, but in the second one, it's your cognitive faculties that are being called into question. So the disanalogy might be right there. Does that help?
Yes, yeah. Although I'm still finding myself not fully moved, and let me see if I can give you a sense of why. And I invite you to tell me that this doesn't move you either, because that would be helpful to me as I clarify this. Think about, there's a debate in philosophy of science. Bas van Fraasen's famous for this in his constructive empiricist move, where he basically says, look, when we're using our unaided perceptual faculties, we can be entitled to believe things that our unaided perceptual faculties give us, but as soon as we use things that augment our faculties, like looking through electron microscopes or looking through these telescopes very powerful telescopes that we look at the stars, we shouldn't believe any of the things that we should rather just regard ourselves as getting perceptual experience of the sort that scientific theory should be able to accommodate. So von Fraasen's idea seems to be, look, our perceptual faculties are perfectly okay when we use them in ordinary life, but as soon as you use them under conditions for which they haven't evolved, not his language, but you can imagine him saying this.
Sure.
You should be careful. Okay, but still I say that's fine, but as long as we have some sense of how the telescope or the microscope works, I'm not entirely sure that we can't continue to rely on our faculties, even though we are now using them to look at the very, very small and the very, very large and far away. And those are things for which our faculties did not evolve to give us to provide us information with.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does make sense, because Nate Laufer and I have been going back and forth on this, and he gives the same answer, which no surprise there, right?
Yes.
So that's good. That's helpful. What I'm thinking basically, and I don't want to bake too much into the cake here against the simulation hypothesis proponent, and so I won't do that, but just for sake of argument here, if you came to find out that you live in a simulation and the simulator designed you to your cognitive faculties to arrive at truth like less than 50% of the time, would you be justified in believing any of your beliefs?
So this is a great question, and this is a question that I have to confess has perplexed me for a long time. There's a great literature, if you don't know it, you may already know it, but maybe some of your listeners don't know it. There's a great literature on higher order evidence that worries about things like this. And a really lovely philosopher, David Christensen at Brown, has pointed out in several of his recent papers on these kinds of topics that if I come to the conclusion that my faculties are unreliable, and he, by the way, Christensen isn't the only one who said this. I think Adam Elga has a paper on this as well. If I've come to the conclusion that my faculties are unreliable, or as I think Elga calls it, anti-reliable, it's not obvious that I should even begin to accept that very claim. Right. Unless I have grounds for thinking that the faculties that I've used to come to the conclusion that my faculties are anti-reliable is itself reliable. Right. It's not clear that I can have any stable standing point here whatsoever. And so once you begin to entertain these kinds of skeptical worries, I think you're probably going to end up with not being able to think anything rationally or with justification.
Right. That's great. Okay. So that's the goal for me, to pit that against the simulation hypothesis. And I'm probably not there yet, so I gotta do some more. But that's really helpful.
Good luck.
Thank you. I'm gonna track that down.